All right, let's get into Kings Canyon National Park. It's definitely a place that lives up to the word dramatic. It's tucked away there in California's southern Sierra Nevada.
Hmm.
And you often hear it mentioned, almost in the same breath as Sequoia National Park, its neighbor. They share a border, and the National Park Service manages them together.
Yeah, and you see why they're linked. It's such a huge, amazing area they protect together.
Mhm.
But Kings Canyon itself, wow. Some of its features are just, well, on a whole other level.
Right.
We're talking glacier-carved valley, deeper than a mile, peaks soaring up over 14,000 feet. It's staggering.
It really is immense. And then you add in the alpine meadows, those uh, really powerful rivers, and of course the giant sequoias that everyone knows about.
The famous groves, yeah.
So using the material we've got, our plan today is really to explore what makes Kings Canyon this unique combination of history, incredible geography, living things, and a really powerful story about preservation, how it was fought for.
It really is a park whose existence feels like a victory,
Yeah,
a hard-won thing.
absolutely. So let's start right there. How did this place actually become a park? The story seems to kick off with General Grant National Park way back in 1890.
That's right. And initially, it was quite focused. The main goal was just protecting a small patch of those giant sequoias. Logging was rampant all around.
Just a small patch.
Yeah, initially. But the idea, the vision for protecting the much bigger Kings Canyon area, that was around decades earlier.
Oh, really?
Yeah, naturalists, famously John Muir, saw the incredible beauty there, the wildness, and were arguing for its protection long, long before the larger park actually happened.
But as you'd guess, wanting to protect something that valuable, well, it bumps up against commercial interests, doesn't it?
Always. It wasn't just the timber, though that was huge. You had stockmen wanting grazing land, lumbermen, and maybe the biggest fight, people looking at it for water power, hydroelectric potential.
Now, the water issue, that sounds like a major hurdle.
It was probably the toughest one. There was this thing, the Federal Water Power Act of 1920. It got amended later, but basically it said existing national parks were safe from new dam projects.
Okay.
But any future parks or additions, they were fair game.
Yeah.
And Kings Canyon, with its deep canyons, well, it looked perfect for building reservoirs. Places like Los Angeles were actively looking at sites there.
Wow. So that made the conservation fight extra difficult here.
Extremely. You had major cities eyeing the water resources within the very area conservationists wanted to protect as wilderness.
So how on earth did the conservation side push back against that kind of, well, economic pressure and political weight?
Well, this is where groups like the Sierra Club become absolutely essential. They weren't just, saying save the trees. They were playing the long game, strategizing, lobbying for decades.
Really digging in.
Yes, and keeping that vision alive through all the pushback.
And there's one name that always seems to pop up in this fight, Ansel Adams. We think of him as this iconic photographer.
And he was, but his work here was so much more than just art. It was a political weapon, really.
A weapon? How so?
Well, Adams was a really committed Sierra Club member. He used those incredibly moving landscape photos he took as a direct lobbying tool. He'd literally take portfolios of his prints to Washington, D.C. to show lawmakers.
You mean showing them the actual photo?
Exactly. Imagine trying to convince someone who's maybe never seen the Sierra Nevada, showing them these powerful, stark images of the scale, the beauty. It was visual proof. He worked really closely with people like the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Harold Ikes, to build that crucial political backing for a park bill.
That's fascinating, using art as direct advocacy, and all that effort, it eventually led to a big moment in 1940, right?
A huge moment. The park was massively expanded. It swallowed up the old General Grant National Park, added over 400,000 acres of high Sierra wilderness, and got its current name, Kings Canyon National Park.
A massive win. But reading the details, it wasn't quite a complete victory, was it? There was a catch.
Definitely a catch. A major compromise, actually. Some key areas, specifically Cedar Grove down in the canyon bottom, and also Tehipe Valley, both seen as prime spots for reservoirs, they were deliberately left out of the 1940 park.
Ah, so the water interests managed to keep those potential sites available.
They did. They held on to that possibility, so the fight wasn't over.
It kept going. For how long?
Another 25 years. It's kind of amazing. It wasn't until 1965 that those specific areas, Cedar Grove and Tehipe Valley, were finally added to the park. That really completed the vision for protecting the heart of the Kings Canyon system.
Wow, 25 more years. That persistence really shaped the park we see today, didn't it?
Absolutely. The result, looking back from, say, the late 20th century, is a park that's incredibly wild in its eastern section. almost entirely roadless, closed to hunting, mostly only reachable by foot or horseback. It really stands as a major win for wilderness preservation over development.
So if you look at a map of the park, its shape, its access, that's all a result of this long history.
It's a direct fingerprint of those decades of fighting, negotiating, and advocating against some really powerful economic forces. It's history written onto the landscape in terms of how we can use it.
Okay, so we've talked about how it became a park. Let's shift gears to what the park actually is, physically. That landscape.
Hmm.
It sounds like it was carved by some pretty immense forces. It feels like two different parts almost joined together.
That's a great way to put it. It really does feel like two distinct zones. You've got the smaller, older western part centered around Grant Grove.
Right, where the sequoias are.
Exactly. That's where the big sequoia groves that started the whole protection effort are located. And it's where you find most of the visitor centers, lodging, that kind of thing.
And then there's the huge eastern section.
Yes, the much, much larger part. Almost all of it is designated wilderness. And that's where you find the park's namesake, Kings Canyon itself.
The actual canyon.
The actual canyon, a really stunning, incredibly rugged valley, sliced deep by glaciers in the past, following the middle and south forks of the Kings River, and Cedar Grove, remember, the area they fought over for so long.
Yeah.
It's the only place you can actually drive your car down into the bottom of that vast eastern wilderness section. Everywhere else is trail access only.
Just one road in. That really gives you a sense of the scale, the remoteness of the rest of it. And the mountains there, they sound spectacular.
Oh, they are. Some of the most dramatic parts of the Sierra Nevada. Yeah, these prominent sub-ranges kind of defining the park. The Palisades on the eastern edge. That's where North Palisade is. The park's highest point at 14,248 feet.
Over 14,000 feet.
Mm-hmm. And the Great Western Divide runs right through the park with multiple peaks over 13,000 feet. Plus other really rugged ranges like the Monarch, Goddard, LeConte, Black Divides, all studded with these high alpine lakes.
And you mentioned glaciers. It sounds like their signature is everywhere.
It's like a textbook of glacial geology, but, real and massive. You see the bare, polished granite, the steep slopes covered in broken rock that's called talus.
Talus, right.
You see hanging valleys perched high up, often with waterfalls tumbling out, sharp knife-edge ridges called arêtes, those bowl-shaped depressions carved into the mountainsides called cirques, and yes, literally hundreds of alpine lakes scooped out and polished by the ice.
It sounds like the raw bones of the earth are just laid bare. And are there still glaciers today? Or remnants?
There are some, yeah. I mean, the massive Ice Age glaciers are long gone, of course. Yeah. But there were smaller, modern snowfields and actual glaciers that formed more recently, probably during colder snaps in the last 1,000 years or so.
Like mini ice ages?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
The Palisade Glacier, which is actually just outside the park boundary, but right there, is the biggest one left in the whole Sierra Nevada range.
The biggest in the Sierra.
Mm-hmm. But this connects to what's happening everywhere, these modern glaciers. They're melting fast.
Mm-hmm.
The sources we looked at mentioned that with current warming trends, they could be gone within decades.
Wow. Gone completely. That's sobering.
It is.
Which kind of leads us into the living things within this incredible sculpted landscape. The biodiversity. Obviously, the giant sequoias are the headliners.
They're the icons, for sure.
Yeah.
But the park supports a really rich variety of life beyond the big trees. Biodiversity studies suggest we have a pretty good handle on the plants and the vertebrate animals, mammals, birds, fish, etc.
Okay, reasonably well known.
Reasonably well known.
Yeah.
But interestingly, there's a big acknowledged gap in our knowledge when it comes to invertebrates.
Invertebrates, you mean like insects, spiders, worms, that sort of thing? Why would that be a gap in a place studied for so long?
Well, it just highlights how incredibly complex these ecosystems are. Invertebrates are massively diverse, often really small, hard to identify, and need very specialized study methods. So while we know a lot about the sequoias and the bears and the deer, there's this huge foundational layer of the ecosystem, all those little critters, where the data is still pretty limited.
Huh. That's actually quite surprising. You'd think after more than a century. Anyway, the sources also mentioned that biodiversity isn't uniform across the park. It changes with elevation.
Yeah, absolutely. Plant species richness, for example, the number of different plant types peaks at mid-elevations, say roughly between 1,500 and 3,000 meters, or about 5,000 to 10,000 feet.
Oh, hi there.
Well, you get this mix of conditions. Not as hot and dry as the foothills, not as cold and harsh as the highest peaks. So you get different forest types mingling with meadows.
Yeah.
Sort of a sweet spot for variety.
Makes sense. But this natural world, it's not pristine, is it? Humans have had an impact.
Far from pristine. Like most national parks, Kings Canyon faces real challenges. Non-native plants are definitely an issue, especially down in the lower elevation grasslands. They can outcompete the native species and change the whole ecosystem.
Right.
And sadly, there are species that used to live here that are now gone from the park.
Hmm.
We call that extirpation. The grizzly bear, the brown bear is one. The California condor is another, though there are efforts to reintroduce condors elsewhere in California.
So some species lost entirely from the park area.
Yes. And there are quite a few other species still present, but considered of special concern because their populations might be vulnerable.
And looking forward, environmental changes are a big factor.
Huge. Climate change is specifically called out as a major stressor. It affects everything, whether species can survive and reproduce in their current spots, where they might need to move on the landscape, the timing of
The
things.
timing, like when flowers bloom.
Exactly. That's called phenology. When flowers bloom, when insects emerge, when birds migrate. Climate change can throw all those carefully synchronized natural events out of whack.
How does that specifically play out in a place like Kings Canyon, according to the sources? Is there an example?
Yeah, they give a really concrete example looking at wetlands, meadows, and marshes. Under predicted hotter, drier climate scenarios, these crucial wetland areas could shrink significantly. Some might even dry up completely and transition to more upland-type vegetation.
And that causes problems.
Big problems, more erosion, for one. And it makes it easier for those non-native plants we mentioned to invade and take over. Even scenarios with more rain aren't necessarily good if the timing or intensity leads to more erosion. So, figuring out which specific wetlands are most vulnerable is a really high priority for the park managers. They're critical habitats.
It really shows how interconnected everything is and how park managers have to constantly adapt. Speaking of management and human history, there are some fascinating traces of the past you can still see in the park today, aren't there?
Oh yeah. The human story here goes way back, thousands of years, with indigenous peoples like the Western Mono living in the region.
Long before it was a park.
Long before. Then, when the first white settlers started arriving,
Yeah.
like Hale Tharp in the 1850s, it led to really big changes and shifts in where indigenous people lived. The sources note that specifically in the giant forest area, indigenous presence had effectively ceased by 1865, which was less than 10 years after Tharp first showed up.
Such rapid change, and those early settlers, their focus was often on using the resources, right? Especially the timber.
Absolutely. Exploitation was the name of the game early on. Logging kicked off in places like Grant Grove back in the 1860s. One huge sequoia grove nearby, Converse Basin, was almost completely flattened by logging. Though, ironically, they spared the very biggest tree there, the bull tree.
They cut down almost everything but the biggest one.
It is that way. And there's that amazing story about the tree cut down for the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
It was enormous, like 300 feet tall.
Yep.
They shipped a section of it back east, but people apparently just couldn't believe a single tree could be that massive. They dismissed it as the California hoax.
A hoax. They thought it was fake.
Initially, yeah.
Yeah.
Hard to fathom today.
Huh.
But you can actually still see the centennial stump and a big chunk of that very tree right there in Great Grove. It's a really stark physical reminder of that time and how people viewed those ancient trees.
Wow. A piece of history right there. And logging wasn't the only early impact, was it?
No, not at all. Livestock grazing, especially huge herds of sheep-hoofed locusts, Muir called them, grazed all over the High Sierra in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
And that caused damage.
Massive damage. They trampled fragile meadows, which led to serious erosion. Plus, this era was when predators like grizzly bears and wolves were aggressively hunted and basically wiped out across the Sierra, largely because they were seen as threats to the livestock.
So the grazing had ripple effects.
Big time. Eventually, grazing got regulated, but sheep were banned entirely from Kings Canyon once it became a national park because they were just too destructive to the landscape.
And even just people visiting caused problems sometimes.
Yeah, even well-intentioned actions could backfire, like visitors feeding deer. It seemed harmless, but it led to deer populations booming unnaturally high in some areas.
There are too many deer.
Too many for the vegetation to support. They were overgrazing, damaging the plants. It got so bad ecologically that in the 1940s, the Park Service actually had to implement a controversial program to cull to reduce the deer herd size to try and restore some balance.
That must have been controversial.
Very. But it shows the complex consequences of human interaction.
There's also a really unique piece of the park's administrative history involving the Buffalo Soldiers, isn't there?
Yes, a really fascinating chapter. For a few years in the early 20th century, specifically 1903 to 1906, the park, well, The area that would become the larger park was actually managed by troops from the Black Ninth Cavalry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers. Captain Charles Young was a notable leader during that time. They served as park guardians during a really critical period of transition and pressure.
That's incredible history. So fast forward to today, how does the park manage all these complex resources and challenges?
They use a system called a Resource Stewardship Strategy, or RSS. The key idea is that it's meant to be flexible, adaptive. It tries to respond to ongoing changes, both in the environment and, in how people use the park.
Adaptive management.
Exactly. It combines direct actions like restoration projects with scientific research and monitoring, and also education for the public.
And volunteers are involved.
A huge part of it. The strategy really emphasizes volunteer stewardship is vital. Volunteers help out with science, doing community monitoring, they help educate visitors, they do hands-on work to improve trails or habitats.
So people can really get involved.
Definitely. And another key tool the park uses is fire, both managing natural lightning-caused fires and setting carefully planned prescribed burns.
Using fire intentionally.
Yes, especially for the sequoia groves. Fire is actually essential for their health and for new seedlings to sprout. So managing fire is a critical part of vegetation management. And this whole RSS plan, it's not static. They review it every year to make sure it's still relevant and effective.
Okay, so with all that context, the history, the geology, the ecosystems, the management, how does someone actually go and experience this wild place?
The best part. The opportunities are as vast as the park itself. Hiking is probably the main way people connect with the wilderness here.
Trails everywhere.
All sorts. You've got everything from super easy paved paths, like the Grant Tree Trail near the General Grant Sequoia, perfect for anyone.
Accessible.
Very accessible. All the way up to incredibly challenging multi-day backpacking trips deep into the wilderness. Think iconic routes like the Ray Lakes Loop or sections of the famous John Muir Trail, which runs through the park.
And if you want to do those longer trips, you need permits.
Absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm.
Any overnight stay in the backcountry requires a wilderness permit. You need to plan ahead for those. The Park Service has good info, and they even have an official park app now with maps and information that works offline.
Offline maps are key out there, I bet.
Crucial. Cell service is pretty much non-existent once you leave the main developed areas like Grant Grove or Cedar Grove.
What about for the really adventurous types?
Well, for those with the skills and experience, there's technical rock climbing. Places like Tehipi Dome and the Sphinx offer big wall challenges. Canyoneering is possible too. But we're talking serious, remote, rugged terrain. Definitely not for beginners.
Right. High commitment stuff. And what about the rivers? Can you raft or kayak?
Fishing is popular in many areas.
Yeah.
But the Kings River itself, it demands serious respect, especially in the spring and early summer when the snow melt is roaring down.
Powerful water.
Incredibly powerful and freezing cold. Whitewater rafting is done commercially downstream, outside the park. But within the park, the river can be extremely dangerous for boating or even just trying to cross on foot. That's why the park maintains bridges on the main trails over the major forks. River crossings generally become much safer later in the summer and early fall when the water levels drop.
Good to know. What if you visit in winter?
Winter brings a totally different feel. Cross-country skiing and snowshoeing are the main activities. You can explore the sequoia groves in the snow, which is magical.
Sounds beautiful.
It is. But longer backcountry trips in winter, that's really only for highly experienced and prepared winter travelers. Conditions can be severe, avalanche risk is real, and there's very limited ranger patrol out there in the winter months.
So the park isn't just this isolated natural wonder. It clearly connects to the local economy, too.
Oh, for sure. Even looking at data from quite a while back, 2002, Sequoia and Kings Canyon together saw over 1.1 million recreation visits. That many people coming to an area definitely has an economic ripple effect.
How does that work?
Well, all those visitors spend money on lodging nearby, in restaurants, gas stations, grocery stores, buying souvenirs. That spending supports local businesses, creates jobs, generates income for people living in the gateway communities. It adds significant economic value to the region.
So the parks are economic engines for the area, too.
In a very real way, yes.
And as you wander around the park today, you can actually bump into physical remnants of that long history we've been talking about.
You really can. You can walk right up to the Gamlin Cabin, built way back in 1872. It's the oldest surviving building in the park.
From 1872, still standing.
Still standing. And the Centennial Stump is right there in Grant Grove, that physical piece of the California hoax story.
Wow.
And there are other historic structures, too, like a building called Residence 55 in Giant Forest Village, or the Artist Cabin down in Cedar Grove. Some of these have actually been recommended for preservation because they represent different eras of the park's history and management. They're tangible links to the past.
So wrapping this up, Kings Canyon National Park. It's just a place of incredible scale, isn't it? Profound beauty and this really complex, layered history, conflict, dedication, preservation. It's all there.
It really is. It offers such a spectrum, from those easily accessible groves where you can just stand and be completely humbled by trees that were alive thousands of years ago,
Yeah.
all the way to this vast, raw, rugged wilderness that feels like it was just shaped yesterday by ice and time. It's a landscape defined as much by nature's power as by the sheer persistence of the people who fought to keep it wild.
A really powerful combination.
And, as we see the landscape continuing to change, with those glaciers melting, ecosystems shifting because of climate change.
Yeah, that's the looming tension, isn't it?
It really is. How does that change our job, our responsibility in taking care of these wild places? How do we make sure that the essential wild character of a place like Kings Canyon actually survives for future generations to experience?
That is definitely something we're thinking about long after we finish talking.